Archival file number 312, stored in the holdings of the Central Naval Archives, contains the protocol of the inspection of the underwater hull section of Object 035, better known as the battleship Novorossiysk. The document, dated October 30th, 1955, records the presence of a through-hole in the area of the 155th frame. The edges of the metal plating, 22 millimeters thick, are bent inward toward the hull at an angle of 45 degrees. The total area of destruction in the double bottom region amounts to 150 square meters. The layer of silt on the seabed at the battleship's moorings site is disturbed to a depth of up to 2 meters, indicating the impact of a powerful hydraulic strike from below. These dry figures became the starting point for the work of the Government Commission and gave rise to discussions that have not subsided for 7 decades. Subscribe to our channel to support the creation of detailed historical studies and gain access to in-depth reconstructions of key events in world history. Your participation allows us to continue working with archival documents and technical reports. To understand the scale of the disaster, it is necessary to analyze the military technical base of the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. The battleship Novorossiysk, formerly the Italian Giulio Cesare, was laid down in 1911 and underwent a deep modernization in the 1930s. The ship's displacement was 29,100 tons. The main battery artillery consisted of 10 320mm guns. The anti-torpedo protection system was built on the principles of the Pulizzi design. Hollow cylinders 3.4 meters in diameter intended to absorb the energy of an explosion. However, by the time the ship was transferred to the Soviet Union in 1949, the technical condition of the mechanisms was rated as satisfactory only partially. The Italian side handed over the vessel with a minimal set of technical documentation. Soviet engineers faced the fact that the electrical networks operated on direct current at 220 volts, while fleet standards required different parameters. The damage control system was not unified with domestic pumping stations. Despite this, by the mid-1950s, Novorossiysk was considered the most powerful combat unit in the Black Sea Basin. October 28, 1955. The ship had returned from its last training cruise of the season to participate in solemn events dedicated to the 30th anniversary of the October Revolution. At 17 hours 30 minutes, the battleship moored to buoy number 3 in Sevastopol's northern bay. The depth at this point is 17 meters, with about 10 meters of water under the keel and a thick layer of viscous silt. On board were more than 1,500 members of the regular crew, as well as reinforcements consisting of cadets and sailors from other ships. The total personnel strength that night exceeded 1,600 people. At 1:30 a.m. on October 29, 1955, an explosion occurred under the bow of the battleship on the starboard side. The force of the initial impulse, according to experts' calculations, corresponded to the detonation of 1,200 kilograms in TNT equivalent. The shockwave passed through all decks, piercing the hull straight through from keel to upper deck. At 1:31 a.m., a second explosion occurred, recorded by Coastal Service acoustic posts. The power of the second explosion was lower, but it led to deformation of the bulkheads in the area of the first and second berthing compartments. Here emerges the first discrepancy in the archival sources. The battleship's watch log records 2 distinct jolts with a 4-second interval, while the Coastal Service records describe a single seismic oscillation of large amplitude. The difference in instrument readings and human testimonies points to the possible detonation of multiple charges or to complex wave interference in the confined space of the bay. 3 minutes after the explosion, at 1:33 a.m., the main lighting on the ship went out. The diesel generators in the forward compartment failed. The ship began taking on water at a rate of 35 tons per minute. At 1:40 a.m., the acting ship commander, Captain Second Rank Khurshudov, declared battle stations. By 2 a.m., the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Parkhomenko, arrived on the battleship. By that time, the trim by the bow was 3 degrees, and the list to port had reached 1 degree. Analysis of the command's decisions reveals a critical planning error. According to the regulations of that time, in the event of flooding threat in shallow water, the ship should have immediately begun towing to a shoal. However, the order to commence towing was issued only at 2:30 a.m. For 50 precious minutes, the battleship remained stationary. When the tugs Morskoy Okhotnik and Gromov attempted to shift the multi-ton mass from its place, the bow section had already settled firmly into the seabed, acting like an anchor. The tug's engines lacked the power to overcome the silt resistance. Here is recorded the second error. Stability calculations were conducted without accounting for the free surface effect of the water. The enormous masses of water shifting inside the hull created dynamic loads that had not been anticipated by the design. By 3:40 a.m., the list to port had increased to 10 degrees. On the poop deck and upper deck, more than 800 personnel not involved in emergency work had gathered. Admiral Parkhomenko rejected the Fleet Chief of Staff's proposal for immediate evacuation of the excess personnel. This decision was based on fears of causing panic and hindering the emergency team's work. However, the technical audit shows that by this point, the pumps were no longer coping with the water inflow, as the main pipelines had been severed, and the portable pumps had a capacity of only 80 cubic meters per hour. At 4:04 a.m., the list reached the critical mark of 17 degrees. At that moment, an event occurred that predetermined the flagship's demise. Soaked and shifted cargoes in the magazines and berthing compartments created an overturning moment. At 4:14 a.m., the Novorossiysk abruptly rolled over to port and capsized keel up. The enormous mass of metal crushed hundreds of people who were on the deck. The ship's hull remained afloat in the inverted position for several hours, held by an air cushion. Through the steel plating, rescuers could hear knocks from people in the internal compartments. But the lack of underwater cutting equipment and fears of releasing the air prevented an effective rescue operation. The total number of those permanently disabled that night amounted to 604 people, according to official lists. But subsequent investigations raised this figure to 614. These were sailors, petty officers, and officers, most of whom perished in the battle with the elements directly inside the hull. The loss of such a portion of the personnel in the flagship became the largest disaster of the Soviet Navy in peacetime. Turning to a critical audit of the versions, one must examine the hypothesis of a German bottom mine. By 1955, 28 bottom mines of the RMH and LMB types, laid by the Luftwaffe during the years of the Second World War, had been discovered and neutralized in Sevastopol's northern bay. The technical specifications of the German RMH mine include a 970-kilogram charge and a combined acoustic magnetic fuse. However, the service life of the power supply batteries for these fuses was no more than 9 years under ideal storage conditions. By 1955, 11 years had passed since the installation of the last mines. The probability of a spontaneous detonation from a degraded battery is extremely low. Archival documents of the Malyshev Commission note a third contradiction. The crater diameter on the seabed measured 9 meters, corresponding to an explosion of much greater power than the standard charge of a single German mine. To achieve such an effect, 2 or 3 mines lying in the same spot would have had to detonate simultaneously, which is statistically improbable. The version of a sabotage act by Italian combat swimmers from the Gamma Group, under the leadership of Prince Valerio Borghese, deserves a detailed technical analysis. Valerio Borghese, known as the Black Prince, was a master of underwater sabotage. After the transfer of Giulio Cesare to the USSR, he publicly stated that the ship should not sail under the Soviet flag. Technically, the operation might have looked like this: the use of a midget submarine of the Piccolo type, delivered to the Sevastopol area on a merchant vessel under a neutral flag. The swimmers could have exited the submarine several miles from the bay entrance, overcome the boom barriers, and attach magnetic charges to the ship's keel. However, implementing such a scenario faces a number of logistical difficulties. The depth at the entrance to the northern bay and the Coastal Guard's hydrophone system should have detected the movement of an underwater object. On the night of October 29th, visibility was 10 miles, and the sea state was 2 on the Beaufort scale. No observation post reported suspicious activity. Moreover, attaching a 1-ton charge under the keel of a ship moving in the water or moored at a buoy requires high precision and prolonged underwater work in conditions of strong currents, which that night reached 2 knots. Despite the absence of direct evidence, the sabotage version is supported by the fact that after the explosion, obituaries appeared in the Italian press about heroes who fulfilled their duty to Rome, the content of which was veiled. Special attention should be paid to the state of discipline and organization of service on the battleship. The Commission established that hatches between decks, contrary to regulations, were left open to provide ventilation on the warm evening. This contributed to the instantaneous spread of water through the internal compartments. If the watertight bulkheads had been secured, according to the combat duty regulations, the ship's survivability time would have increased 3-fold, allowing the evacuation of the entire crew. The dry outcome of the investigation led to large-scale personnel reshuffles in the leadership of the Soviet Navy. Admiral of the Fleet of the Soviet Union Kuznetsov was removed from his post and demoted in rank. The Commission recognized the cause of the disaster as an explosion of a German mine, but in a classified report, it pointed to the unacceptably low level of crew readiness for damage control under nighttime conditions. The material and technical base of the fleet suffered irreparable damage. The cost of the battleship Novorossiysk, taking into account its armament and modernization, was estimated at hundreds of millions of rubles at the exchange rate of that time. But the main loss was the qualified personnel, specialists in complex artillery and navigation systems. In 1957, the ship's hull was raised and dismantled for scrap at the Sevastopol plant. During the raising, it was discovered that the armored deck had ruptures characteristic of a shaped charge effect, which, once again, indirectly confirmed the possibility of using special sabotage charges rather than a standard bottom mine. This tragedy demonstrated that even in peacetime, on the inner roads of the fleet's main base, technical miscalculations and errors in management can lead to results comparable to a defeat in a major naval battle. A dispassionate analysis of the actions of all services that night remains a textbook for modern emergency rescue specialists, emphasizing that, at sea, the price of every minute is measured in hundreds of lives, and the price of every misinterpreted figure in the regulations is the destruction of entire squadrons. To reconstruct the chronology in detail, it is necessary to refer to the minute-by-minute log of reports received at the fleet's central command post. At 1:35 a.m., the operational duty officer received a report of a powerful explosion in the area of buoy number 3. At 1:42 a.m., a group of diver rescuers was placed on alert, but their arrival at the side of the Novorossiysk was delayed until 2:15 a.m. due to the lack of boats ready for immediate departure. This time became critical for assessing the nature of the damage below the waterline. When senior diver First Class Nikolaev descended underwater at 2:20 a.m., he reported a jagged hole through which the ship's internal structures were visible. However, due to the turbidity of the water and the silt stirred up by the explosion, he was unable to determine the exact boundaries of the breach. The error in the initial assessment led to the command on deck considering the damage localized and repairable with patches. In reality, the destruction affected the hull's structural framework, making the application of patches technically impossible. Analysis of the stability of metal structures under dynamic impact conditions shows that the Italian steel used in the battleship's construction had increased brittleness at low temperatures. Although the water temperature that night was 15 degrees Celsius, the residual stresses in the hull after decades of service played their role. The deformation of the longitudinal beams caused the ship to lose the rigidity of its box structure and begin to bend under its own weight as soon as the bow settled on the bottom while the stern remained afloat. At 3 a.m., the calculated mass of water taken on board amounted to 4,500 tons. With such a volume of flooding, the ship's center of gravity shifted upward by 1.2 meters. The process of progressive flooding began through the ventilation shafts, which were at the level of the main deck. At 3:30 a.m., the water reached the level of the boilers in boiler rooms number 3 and 4. Steam escaping under high pressure created additional difficulties for the emergency teams, effectively blocking access to the flooding valves in the opposite compartments for leveling the list. The lack of coordination between the shore fire brigades and the ship's specialists led to the hoses supplied from the shore having a different type of connecting nuts. As a result, for 30 minutes, attempts to supply the ship's firefighting system from shore pumps were unsuccessful. This is yet another example of technical incompatibility that, in the conditions of a catastrophe, escalates to the level of a critical factor. Considering the consequences, it is worth noting that the loss of the Novorossiysk accelerated the Soviet Navy's transition to missile armament. The country's leadership, in the person of Khrushchev, drew conclusions about the ineffectiveness and vulnerability of large artillery ships in modern warfare. This led to the decommissioning and scrapping of several more battlecruisers and battleships, altering the strategic balance of forces in the Black Sea for decades to come. The statistics on losses by specialties are as follows. 40% of those killed in action were engine room crew and bilge machinists, who remained at their posts in the lower hull until the very last moment, trying to keep the generators running. 30% were cadets, located in the forward berthing compartments, who bore the brunt of the blast wave. The remaining losses fell on personnel who were on deck at the moment of capsizing and were drawn into the vortex by the sinking ship. The engineering audit of the hull after it was raised in 1957 revealed that the explosion occurred at the point where 3 critically important bulkheads converged. This could not have been a random coincidence with the detonation of an old mine. The probability that a freely drifting or mud-buried projectile would strike precisely this vulnerable structural node is less than 0.02%. This observation remains a weighty argument for proponents of the theory of deliberate sabotage carried out by highly skilled specialists who had detailed blueprints of the ship in hand. In conclusion, it must be emphasized that archival data on the loss of the battleship Novorossiysk still bear secrecy classifications on a number of documents concerning radio intercepts in the Mediterranean region for the period from October 25th to 30th, 1955. It is possible that the final answer to the question of the involvement of external forces in the destruction of the flagship lies there. For now, we have only a chain of documented technical failures, command errors, and the indisputable fact of the loss of one of the most powerful combat units of its time. This episode in history remains an example of how the technical complexity of an object, combined with the human factor and the uncertainty of the external environment, creates conditions for a catastrophe whose consequences cannot be fully eliminated even after decades of analytical work. The total volume of destruction recorded at the site of the third barrel's anchorage amounted to more than 5,000 cubic meters of displaced soil. This amount of energy, instantly released under the ship's keel, left no chance for the survival of the forward structures. The logic of events indicates that the Novorossiysk was doomed already in the first second after detonation, and all subsequent actions merely prolonged the agony of the steel giant. Errors in assessing the situation only increased the number of victims, turning a technical accident into a national tragedy that forever changed the face of the Soviet fleet and approaches to securing maritime borders. Every detail of this reconstruction, from the thickness of the armor to the intervals between explosions, confirms. In conditions of large-scale technical failure, the only reliable tool for salvation remains strict adherence to protocols and timely acknowledgement of the criticality of the situation. The lessons of the Novorossiysk are embedded in the modern regulations of all the world's navies, where every rule is written at the price of those who fell in battle in the cold waters of Sevastopol's northern bay. Analysis of the material technical support for the Sevastopol base during that period shows that the warehouses held a sufficient quantity of powerful pontoons capable of keeping a ship afloat, even after a loss of 40% of its buoyancy reserve. However, their deployment required prior planning and drills, which had not been conducted in the 2 years leading up to the disaster. This systemic failure in preparing the fleet's auxiliary forces became the foundation upon which the entire chain of subsequent failures was built. The remnants of the Novorossiysk, melted down at metallurgical plants, became part of new Soviet ships. But the memory of the tragedy lives on in the form of the Grieving Sailor Monument and hundreds of volumes of archival files which continue to be studied by military historians and engineers around the world. The brief and concise conclusions of the 1955 Commission, despite their political tint, remain an important document that records the end of the battleship era and the beginning of a new one, where the main role is played by technologies of covert impact and precision-guided weapons. The final calculation of material losses included not only the battleship itself, but also 3 boats damaged during the hull's capsizing, as well as a significant amount of port equipment. The total damage to the bay's infrastructure was not rectified until 1960. All these facts, presented without emotional coloring, form a clear picture of how a single incident can destabilize the operations of an entire military district and require decades to restore technical and personnel potential. Thus, the reconstruction of the 1955 events is complete. We relied on supply facts, the bay's topography, and reports from diver teams to restore the picture of the flagship's demise. The logic of the archives is inexorable. Behind every figure of losses stands a specific technical decision or an error in executing an order. The study of the Novorossiysk is, first and foremost, an investigation into the limits of the strength of technology and management systems under conditions of extreme impact.